Check. Yep. I don't need no stinking microphone. Oh, yeah, that's true. The interwebs needs a microphone. The internet just saw me yawn. The internet just saw me yawn. This feels a bit raucous. Okay. Okay. Yay. Well, I don't go to church on Sunday. I don't get on my knees to pray. Don't memorize the books of the Bible. Got my own special way. I know Jesus loves me. Maybe just a little bit more. I fall down on my knees every Sunday. As the reveillees candy store. Well, it's got to be a chocolate Jesus. Makes me feel so good inside. It's got to be a chocolate Jesus. He'll keep me satisfied. Well, I don't want no apples ever. I don't want no almond joy. There ain't nothing better suitable for this bird. Now the only thing that can pick me up better than a cup of gold. I said, oh man, chocolate Jesus, he will satisfy my soul. And when the weather gets rough and it's risky in the shade, best to wrap the Savior up and set him vain. When he flows like the big muddy, but that's okay. Pour him over ice cream for a nice party. Got to be chocolate Jesus. It's good enough for me. It's got to be chocolate Jesus. It's good enough for me. Well, there's got to be a chocolate Jesus. Makes me feel so good inside. It's got to be chocolate Jesus. Will keep me. I said he will keep me satisfied.
Welcome. I guess I'm elected to welcome you all to Collective. We're glad to see you. Some old faces, some new faces, and you're all very welcome. Who's reading the community statement? Aha. Oh, we have the voice of God reading it today.
I appreciate that you include old faces. We value highly the metaphor of journey. We're different people from different places and backgrounds, representing an intergenerational community, and we've traveled different paths. So, we agree not to make assumptions about the person across from us, next to us, or in conversation with us. We challenge ourselves to be sensitive, knowing this community includes a diverse group of people from lifelong followers of Jesus to people who just now are open to the idea that God might exist. We strive to avoid offense, ask good questions, articulate and explain our responses. We don't assume fluency in Bible, spirituality, or church language because we believe the message of Jesus is not for Christianity, but for humanity. So we do everything in the spirit of love and grace.
We have a reading tonight from Frederick Buechner. He's a favorite of mine. And what he says this time is, if the God you believe in as an idea doesn't start showing up in what happens to you in your own life, you have as much cause for concern as if the God you don't believe in as an idea does start showing up. It is absolutely crucial, therefore, to keep in constant touch with what is going on in your own life story and to pay close to others' lives. If God is present anywhere, it is in those stories that God is present. If God is not present in those stories, then they are scarcely worth telling.
So if you would just close your eyes. If you don't want to, that's fine too. And just be aware of a word or a phrase that grabbed you from that reading. Notice what you notice about it. We're going to spend a few minutes in silence. You may want to talk to God as you understand God about that reading. You may want to just pay attention to your breathing. I'm just going to repeat a short verse and we'll spend time in silence. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am. Be still and know. Be still. Be
Well, here we are again. This is the third time we've met since in the new collective is kind of what I'm calling it these days. And I want to welcome back Heather and Rick, particularly, who have been gone for a while and are back with us tonight. You know, the first night we met together, we talked about new beginnings. And the second night we met together, we talked about longing, belonging, and committing ourselves to this new process. And I promised you that we would not forever keep talking about the mechanics of collective. So I'm here to follow through with that tonight, talking again about spiritual topics, the topic of conceptions of God. And we're going to be talking about this for the next 3 weeks, tonight and a couple of weeks thereafter. This is partly based on a podcast that included Peter Rollins and Rob Bell, talking about 4 different conceptions of God. And we're going to be talking about one of those conceptions tonight, and we'll be talking about the other 3 conceptions next week. I know that people in the room have different conceptions of God. Some people in the room may not even use the word God, but our effort here is not to try to find the true or correct conception of God, but to explore our conception of God and kind of toss that around with conceptions that other people in the room have. So it's partly designed to get to know one another in a spiritual way. Part of this is also based on the work of Marcus Borg. He wrote a book called The God We Never Knew. And I'll tell you a quick story about Marcus Borg. He was a college professor. He was talking to a student, and the student said that he didn't believe in God. And Marcus said, well, tell me about this God that you don't believe in. So this student told him about that God, and Marcus said, well, you know, that's exactly the God I don't believe in either. And they went on to have a good discussion. So I've got some good news and some bad news. The bad news is I'm going to read you some stuff. It's bad for me because I've got to follow Larry and Bill, but I'll struggle through it. The good news is I think it's interesting stuff, and you'll find it engaging, and I hope moving, because I find it very moving stuff. So I'm going to be presenting one of the 4 conceptions of God, which is God as event. And the idea of this is most commonly associated with the theologian John Caputo. And I have a favorite pastor these days, present company excluded. It would... You're right. If I had to pick one, I'm going with Andrew Brown, who is pastoring the Unitarian Church in Cambridge, UK. And I am going to be reading you some things that Andrew included in a sermon in 2012. And he is doing a much better job than I could ever do in explaining this rather abstract concept. So here we go, if I can operate this. Technology strikes again. Okay. let's see, I'm going to read you a couple of brief paragraphs about what God as event is about, and then we're going to look at some examples of that. One way to put what a radical or postmodern theology means is to say it is a theology of the event. Then, everything depends upon what we mean by an event, which for the sake of simplicity I describe as follows. An event is not precisely what happens, which is what the word suggests in English, but something going on in what happens. Something that is being expressed or realized or given shape in what happens. It is not something present, but something seeking to make itself felt in what is present. Things take a postmodern turn in theology when the meditation upon God or the divine is shifted to events, when the location of God or what is divine about God is shifted from what happens, from constituted words and things, to the plane of events. John Caputo, who, along with a number of other key modern theologians, has stopped trying to talk about God as a super being, an ultimate entity, which should only ever be theorized about, and has instead begun to talk about and gesture towards understanding God as event. Caputo's 5 points. I think this is Andrew Brown's interpretation of Caputo's points. Firstly, I do not understand God as something present, but as something seeking to make itself felt in what is present. So for me, it's not quite right to say Jesus is God. I encounter him as my brother, always already a human being like me. But what makes him special to the liberal Christian tradition to which I belong is that he lived in such a way that we felt we saw that which we are minded to call God, making itself felt in Jesus' presence among us. This is why I point so regularly to the example of Jesus and say, look, there, that is what I mean by God. Secondly, it is important to distinguish between the name God and the event that is astir in his name. When I use the word God here, I always try to attach it to events in which we see people called to do true justice, to love mercy, and to walk with God. This is why I point so regularly to any act of justice, mercy, love, and the walking with others and say, look, there, that's what I mean by God. Thirdly, I do not understand God as an ultimate thing, a super being whose existence could be proved by either science or philosophy and theology, because God is that which is astir in all things. This is why I often point to the interconnectedness of the universe, the natural world, and its constant commingling, and say, look, there, that is what I mean by God. Fourthly, I have been persuaded that no matter how beautiful or venerable they are, whether they are Trinitarian or Unitarian, whether they are theist or atheist, all human theories about God can and must always be deconstructed. These theories may and often have had some temporary ad hoc usefulness, but they may never be thought of as being themselves the event that they harbor. This is why I so often point with particular approval to living and always unfolded, devolved, democratic, non-institutional, non-denominational, and non-doctrinal forms of religious community and say, look, there, that's what I mean by God. We have it here. Fifthly, I understand God as event as something that is always calling me from afar. Call it from heaven, if you like, which is always persuading me into living a form of life committed to seeking more justice, more love, more mercy, and a continued walking with each other and God. It is no wonder that to every earthly, coercive human power that wants to control and dominate others and nature, God is indeed a dangerous memory and a new call to reform. This is why I constantly point to utopian visions of human organization, such as the kingdom of God, or in my mind, this amounts to the same thing, the Republic of Heaven, and say, look, there, that is what I mean by God. Beyond all talk and all pointing, in the end, we are simply seeking to live a form of life in which God, as the event of all life, is a trembling, living presence within us, informing us of what is required of us, and which has the power to gift us a meaningful, rich, and satisfying existence. All I can say is that when on a bleak and cold morning and I feel I am in or very close to death's dark veil, I find I have always been graced with the presence of genuine hope and so found the strength to go on. Is this hope and strength to go on a proof of God? No. But even after my deconstruction, I'm still called to point to it and to say to you, look, there. That is what I mean by God. After giving this address later that same evening, the church and the manse were framed by a glorious rainbow, a traditional sign both of God being felt in what is present and of God's covenant with us. Proof of the truth of my words? Oh, of course not. But nevertheless, it still made me want to point to the rainbow and its position and timing and say, if only to myself, look, there, that is what I mean by God. So, the questions tonight are, do you ever have an experience of saying, perhaps just to yourself, look, there, that is what I mean by God? Which of these 5 examples have prompted you to say this? Are there other events that also prompt this thought to you? Should I read that again? Okay, let's review those. Let's run through the 5 examples. Example 1 is the example of Jesus. Example 2 is seeing people doing true justice and so forth. Third is the interconnectedness of the universe. Fourthly is to the always unfolding, devolved, democratic, non-institutional religious communities. And fifth is something calling me from afar, a call from something like heaven or the Republic of God. And then he also talks about the presence of hope in really dark times. And finally, he's talking about a serendipitous event that occurred right after his sermon, that he walks out and he sees a rainbow. And he doesn't think that that is a sign from God. And yet he looks at it and says, look, there, that's what I mean by God. Okay, are we about ready to hear from our groups? Who has the microphone? Okay, what did y'all come up with? Did anybody ever have the Andrew Brown experience of saying, look, there, that's what I mean by God? We finished up talking about that, and I don't think he emphasized that as much as he might have. That he talked about the rainbow, but that wasn't exactly like the all of nature. And he talked about the interconnectedness of the world, but that was kind of different too. That I think people.
One of the things that I said is I had a hard time with the concept that God is an event, because I think of an event as having a beginning and an end, and of God having no beginning and no end. And it was pointed out that my definition of event is limited. It's, that I don't need to look at an event as having a beginning and an end, that it is, could be just life in general, or, it's my conception of what an event is that is making it hard for me to relate to that.
Time is something to live in straight by that God beginning, so beginnings and ends aren't really meaningless to God, I think.
And what makes us aware of it are those recent pictures from the telescope, that things are even bigger than our mind can imagine. And if God isn't everything, then it's bigger than our concept.
And that's a far cry from the belief that the earth is the center of the universe, and the conception of God that came out of that belief. That it's hard to have exactly the same belief about God now that we know that we're in an obscure galaxy in a out of the way neighborhood of the universe. And then the thing about event, that came up in our group too, and it goes back to what he was saying, that it's not the event. The event is indeed something that begins and ends, but it's something that is, and I love the word, something that is a stir in the event, something that is happening within the event that causes it to go in a certain way. And that thing that is a stir is presumably always there, and it's a stir here and there and over there.
For me, you mentioned that Copernican revolution. We're here now at a bigger revolution than when Copernicus said, hey, the earth is not the center of the universe, guys. We're sure not in the church when he said that. But what we're about now is bigger than that. It's a wake-up call to that. We're all connected, guys. We're all connected. And it's not just the internet that's doing it. And the wake-up call to that is very humbling. And for me, that line in what that reading was, to keep in constant touch with what is going on in your own life story. When I and my clients are not in touch with our life story, we're in trouble. And I have to keep in constant contact with that. Because that's where I bump into God. And that's where I get things revealed.
Dave.
I think going off of what they were saying a second ago, the idea of our emotional or
So what about the idea of God as event? When I first heard it, it sounded like a very odd idea to me. Perhaps it did to you as well. Does talking about it kind of change your idea about it? Does it still seem like a weird event, or is it helpful in explaining something?
It makes me look at events differently, because instead of like, here's an event, and here's an event, and here's an event, it's like, okay, there's something uniting all those events, whatever that is. And maybe, the thousands of years since the Big Bang is all one event, still going on, but we don't get to know all the particulars. So, yeah, talking about it and thinking about it has changed my initial response was, no, because God's not just a single event, well, not in a temporal sense. So I'm even, it's changed my thinking.
But, Joy brought up a point, we can talk about these concepts. A love that's shared seems to be something that happens to us while we're observing these events. And for me, when I'm in nature, it helps settle me to the point where I am open for love, or I can give love. And even though we can go into all these intellectual discussions about the concept of time and the concept of the universe, what does it mean if it doesn't generate love? And I think that's what we see here. We see the generation of love. And those are so important. We're all flawed, and there are times we fail. But because observing these events opens us up to generate love, that's why these events are important. And they have to touch you in a personal way. It's important. And you can feel it. We may not be superior to other animals, but our concept of love is something that is important, and is important, that's evolved in us. It wasn't always there. And it's because of our intellectual abilities and our amazement at these things that we can generate love, not just for one another, but for the universe. Let me get on my soapbox now.
Robert?
So, to kind of carry on with that, I've always had a hard time with this idea of believing in a super being, even though growing up Catholic, like that was the thing. Because you always have the question of, okay, now we're learning about the Greeks. Why do they have these gods, and when do we shift their belief in all these other gods? But then you start to read it, and they're describing these experiences, and they've brought that up, just kind of offhandedly about, Moses seeing a burning bush. You go, how come nobody said it's a burning bush? We're okay with that. We're okay with experiencing God as a, and it's in nature. And it's this idea of, I don't need to believe, I need to be more aware. I need to be more open to these experiences, and not just calculating the amount of time it takes me to get from here to pick up my kids to get home and it's those times when I am open to more experiences. And usually I'm open to more experiences when people are showing me love and being nice. And it kind of reminds me to be nice as well. So it kind of piggybacks off what Dan was saying. But that burning bush thing, I hadn't thought about that. And you just kind of threw that out there as I'm like, yeah, they even wrote that one down. And Barbara Brown Taylor talks about that, about he could have just walked right by that bush and went, that bush is on fire. I got to get away from that. But he didn't.
When you think about it, when you think about that idea of God as a concept rather than as a being, if we just look at the biblical history, biblical stories, somewhat historical, and look at the modern history of religion, happened before. It has happened before. But I think one of the things we have to be careful of is that we have to look into ourselves and make sure that we're not going down that same path. And we spoke a little bit about how we look at some people who stand on street corners who have a different perception of God than we have, and we mock them a little bit and feel sorry for them, and we're like, yeah, you got that right. And then we come back here and say, yeah, but we've got it right. So we have to be careful of that because we don't.
There's a great image, it's a meme, and it has the whole timeline of Christianity building, and then the pastor circles the one their tiny little branch of ideology and says, Jesus is so lucky to have us. We finally got it right here, which is ridiculous.
And it's especially important, I think, in the Methodist tradition because the founder of Methodism broke away from the Church of England because it was too dogmatic, and it was like we have to do things. We have to focus on the method of Christ, like Methodism. We have to go out to the hospitals and we have to go and help people and stuff like that, rather than do the dogma. And just a short time later, in our Methodist church is having a big schism because it's more concerned with who people are having sex with and whether they're spreading the word of God. So it doesn't take very long to go back from that idealistic route back to the dogma.
Yeah, for us now, we're in an evolution. Just being part of a collective, because we're doing something, maybe other places are doing it, but we're doing it. And we're becoming church as open people, looking for God, knowing that God is real, and just growing in that reality. So we are in an evolution, just like the earth, the world is in an evolution. We have to be open to the change, and that's what we're doing. We're open to the change.
That sounds like a good note to end on. Thank you all.
Can I have Dave and Sharon to the front, please? I've been coughing, so I'm not touching anything tonight. I thought it was just Bill, but now I'm breaking it too.
Do you need some help here?
We'll get there. All right. I didn't talk much on this one because I got a whole week with this material because Jim was kind enough to send it to me so I would have something to say to you. And it works for me. I really like this because the longer I spend in church work, the less interested I am in proving anything to anyone. I'm interested in sharing stories and perhaps witnessing something with other people, but this really worked for me. And Jim's prompt included a sentence that I love. Right at the beginning it says, "An event is not precisely what happens, but something going on in what happens. Something that is being expressed or realized or given shape in what happens. It's not something present, but something seeking to make itself felt in what is present." And so, in a sense, this very postmodern hot take is fitting for our time, but I think it also hints that maybe postmodern thought has a lot to do with ancient Jewish practice and the mystics of the Christian tradition. This sounds new, and yet it sounds very old. I think they have a lot in common. And it makes me think of this collective phrase, this one's been rattling around for a couple of years, that we focus on the message of Jesus instead of the message about Jesus. That we're less concerned with a debate about the historical person of Jesus, proving this or that thing actually happened, but putting a spotlight on Jesus, not putting a spotlight on Jesus and whether or not we can believe these stories about Jesus, but instead our focus has always been on what Jesus taught, how he communicated values, how he engaged people in stories that accompanied the journey of faith.
And I think it's because we realize that Jesus or God or the universal Christ or a higher power, whatever language you give to it, it's less interesting as a belief or a historical event that can either be accepted or discarded. That idea of theological assent is not always as interesting. I think that the divine is much more interesting as an experience you can get caught up in, a story you can take part in, that we can experience through love and service and justice here and now. In the Christian tradition, the idea that Jesus is not so much pointing to himself, but that he came to essentially walk around and point to God, to say, oh, I think God looks a bit like that, and to make us more aware, as someone said earlier. And by the way, I don't think Jesus ever did this in the form of a 3-part sermon. Like, I don't think Jesus was very interested in proving anything to anyone either, because he seems to have pointed to God mostly in open-ended stories that he encouraged people to debate, or with questions, not with, hey, believe this or don't, right? Again, I think the postmodern thing goes back a long time. And so when we look at the sacramental act of Eucharist, I imagine that for Jesus, this act of sharing the bread and cup was a way of pointing to God. Hey, God is something like this, a way of acting out a story and reliving a moment in such a way that it becomes real for us right here and now. And so I return to that sentence again. An event is not precisely what happens, but something going on in what happens. Something being expressed or realized or given shape in what happens. It's not something present, but something seeking to make itself felt in what is present. Eucharist is a perfect example of this kind of event. A sacrament or a means of grace is the outward and visible expression of inward grace. It's a symbol for something we cannot see but suspect is going on under the surface. It's a practice of looking for that something that is seeking to make itself known. We often don't get a lot of choice in how and when God will show up, that we'll have these moments of witnessing the divine spark. We can't control that, we can't time that, we can't schedule it. It's not exactly something we can manufacture or manifest. Grace and spirit do their own thing. And this act isn't just about what happens. It's not about bread and juice. There's no magic trick. It's not about what is physically present in bread broken. Wink, wink. Not done. And a shared cup. But I suspect that our intention does create something. Our gathering together, our commitment to each other, our desire to break bread with one another, to show up and look for God in one another, does in fact create something that is greater than the sum of its parts. It does at times, and I'm not saying that it works for us all the same all the time, but I'm convinced that it does work from time to time, and that it does work on us, that there's something transformative that happens in this event in which we sometimes witness God. That this act does give us a glimpse of something more. It allows us to experience something together, to effectively point to this open table, this table of self-giving love and community and inclusion and sacrifice and family and welcome and non-judgment, and say, I think God might be something like that. And so this table is set for us, and it's set for all people, and as always, no one will ever be turned away. When you're ready, you can come receive a piece of bread and dip it in the cup.
It's gonna be great.
read super short because there's not many people. Here comes the sun, doo 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 doo. Here comes the sun, and I say it's alright. Little darling, it's been a long, cold, lonely winter. Little darling, it feels like years since it's been here. Here comes the sun, doo 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 doo. Here comes the sun, and I say it's alright. Little darling, the smiles returning to the faces. Little darling, it seems like years since it's been here. Here comes the sun, doo 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 doo. Here comes the sun, and I say it's alright. Sun, 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 here it comes. 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 Little darling, I feel that ice is slowly melting. Little darling, it seems like years since it's been clear. Here comes the sun, doo 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 doo. Here comes the sun, and I say it's alright. Here comes the sun. Here comes the sun. It's alright. And we're go. Wow, that got loud all of a sudden. As you go into the week in front of you, whether it's love or a God you call by some name, I hope you witness something. I hope you glimpse something a little bit more than normal. I hope you experience love or beauty or creation in such a way that it begs for another name. Have a great week. Grace and peace.